There we go. Cool. Yeah, my name is Eric Katz. My Twitter handle. Yeah, I've been a developer for the last decade or so, I guess. Professionally, probably last 6 or 7 years. And between that, I focus on PHP, JavaScript, CSS, HTML, kind of that amalgam of technologies. Yeah, so let's talk about SVGs. SVGs are Scalable Vector Graphics. As you can see, they're called that because they scale indefinitely. Whereas conventional graphics, JPEGs, PNGs, GIFs, whatever you want to call them, don't. So the reason why this is important and why they're becoming more and more relevant nowadays kind of comes from a combination of multiple things. But one of the main differentiations is that SVGs are an XML-based language that makes graphics. So if you ever looked at the source code for an SVG, you get a lot of this XML, this markup, HTML-looking stuff. You get rectangles, circles, ellipses, lines, polygons, paths, etc. Whereas if you try to look at the source of a PNG or any other graphic, you get a bunch of garbled stuff, right? So, yeah. The reason why they're important now is because of a lot of these things, right? These are my iPhones, my models there. And there's the 3, 4, 5, 6 Plus. And basically all these mobile devices that we've had for the last few years, they're all kind of the same size, right? They all fit in your hand, they all fit in your pocket. But the thing that's kind of changed about them is that the actual resolutions of those screens have kind of grown exponentially, right? Like they're not, you're between the 3 and the 4, the actual resolution of those screens is multiplied. And so the way that works is, since the screen itself is kind of stuck to being mobile handheld device, the way they've kind of improved those displays is by stuffing in twice as many pixels as there were before. And the reason why this may cause issues for conventional graphics like JPEGs, PNGs, GIFs, etc., is because these phones are still the same size, and then they virtually display a smaller resolution, but since the graphic is tied to that small resolution, right, you've made this graphic to be full width of an iPhone 3, but on an iPhone 4, 5, and 6, it gets doubled in size, and you end up getting a lot of pixelation. So, yeah, that's kind of what's happening with mobile devices. Not just mobile devices, though. It's also screens, displays, TVs. It used to be a couple years ago, 1080p was this awesome, HD, high-definition television goal. And now Apple just released their new Imac Displays where 1080p is really only this small circle in the corner. So when you start thinking of making websites, making applications, or anything like that for these types of displays, you can't really tie yourself down to the approach that we used briefly, or we still use today for conventional graphics, which is having this at 2 times, at 1.6 times resolution versions of our assets. And then when you have to change those assets, you have to go back and resave them. SVGs are different because the same asset will fit all these displays and scale and look nice and sharp. So, yeah, browser support. Let's talk about browser support. Yeah, basically right now everything works except for IE8. But IE8's 6 years old. Why do we have to keep catering to IE8? I think if we look at current usage, SVG is capable to 94% almost of the world, the US, etc. So let's start using it, the other cool thing about SVGs is that the fallbacks are pretty awesome. You can create an icon font. Raise your hand if you use an icon font for something. Yeah, a lot of you. You know, Font Awesome, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of them out there. And the reason why they're awesome is because you give them a little glyph, or they give you a little glyph, and then you just increase font size, and the glyph stays the same. So you can use Ico Moon, Fontello. There's probably a few other font services to kind of import your SVGs into fonts and then use them for IE8, or even now if you want to use them. Cool part about icon fonts is, you know, the browser loads the icon font once, and then it caches it, so there's no more real load. There's a bunch of JavaScript-related fallbacks, a few techniques I'm not going to go into, but I have slides here that link out to them. But it's pretty easy, the excuse of not using it because browser adoption doesn't exist anymore. Right? So from a designer's perspective, you're probably used to using some of these applications, probably mostly these top 3 maybe. And your design process doesn't really need to change that much from what it has been. One of the things that is more important now, though, as you're exporting graphics and handing them off to somebody else in the project pipeline, or your developer, or somebody intermediary, is to organize your file structure, your actual design files. You know, this has been important for developers for a long time now, where you can't, you know, where semantic structuring of our HTML documents have correlated to higher SEO, higher maintainability, readability, etc. And if more designers adopt this approach, and I think most of you probably do already, then this kind of helps with exporting SVGs, because a lot of times those layer names, those layer group names, all that gets exported into unique IDs that get passed into your SVG. So yeah, here's an example. It might be hard to read, but essentially, right, like I have a experiment group here, and then I have this hanging light folder layer. This is Sketch, by the way, if you haven't used it. It's pretty cool, a lot like Illustrator. I have this bulb path, which is just this aura, and this wiring. And when I go ahead and export this, that SVG format that I talked about earlier kind of already spits out this ID equals wiring, or ID equals aura, or ID equals bulb. And so when I get that as a developer, or when a developer gets that in their SVG file, when they go into it, they already know what that path is, at least like what it's supposed to be, right? And then the cool part about being a developer nowadays is we have all these build task management tools, right? We have Gulp, we have Grunt, and they can help batch process a lot of these files, right? Because when we export from Illustrator, Sketch, all those things, they add a bunch of markup that isn't really necessary for our web apps or for any of our environment. There are a lot of, it's like either a comment tag or an XML namespace for Illustrator, etc. If you are the type of person that really needs a graphical user interface, if you're not used to using Gulp or Grunt, there's solutions for that too. SVG Cleaner, SVGO, GUI, link out to them. Yeah.
How much does that save a lot of file size?
Yeah, so there's definitely different ways you can set up your build management tools, and it kind of depends on how you want to use your SVGs. So if your SVG is already in a state where it's ready to go and you just need to throw it in as like a graphic replacement, then these build task manager tools, what they'll do is they'll automate the process of minimizing the files, because when you export them, by default, they'll be kind of indented and embedded, kind of like an HTML document is normally. So this will help strip out any unnecessary tags and minimize all the white space. So yeah. But as a developer, feel free to open those SVG files. They're not they're not JPEGs, not PNGs. You can actually see the pieces of information that render a graphic. It's kind of a weird space to be in now. And so in doing so, you can do stuff like wrap segments of paths or rectangles into these group tags, give them IDs, give them classes for yourself. You can add contextual comments to those files if you need to, right? Like if it's something, if you're working on some sort of animation using SVGs, help yourself out. You know, don't work with a minified file yet, and give yourself context of what you're doing. Everyone here has probably used SVGs at least in this manner in the web today, right? You just use as a drop-in replacement for your JPEG or your PNG, and you just do image source, etc. Throw in your alt tag because you want to be SEO or accessible friendly. In your CSS, you've probably done this a few times, right? Background, URL, image file, etc. So that's probably like the easiest usage if you're not used to using an SVG. It's really just another image format. You're just plugging it in. Well, the cool thing about SVGs is that you can embed them directly into your HTML document, right? Like, and this is what we were talking about a second ago as far as having kind of semantic IDs and groupings for a lot of your markup, right? So like here we can kind of, without seeing the graphic, we can kind of see what the graphic is. You know, we know how big it is. We know that there's something going on. There's a table. There's some sort of chemistry flask. And then we know that each of these has paths associated with it. The cool part about embedding an SVG file this way is that you can then start styling it using CSS. You know, like if I want to fill all the paths on this flask with a black color and a green stroke, I can do that now as if I was in Illustrator or Sketch, adding those attributes myself. Likewise, you can keep going as far as you want with that example. The cool part about using SVGs this way is that you can also animate them, do all those things that you may already be used to using HTML and CSS and JavaScript, of course, right? That's, I'm calling that a level 2 usage of SVG. And then we have more advanced stuff, right? Like we have the ability to create segments of SVG code that don't display until we need them. So we can create this like definitions block and then add stuff to it, give it an ID, and then reference it later in an SVG and say, hey, this rectangle, we want it to have this linear gradient. You know, this circle, we want it to have this pattern. And all those things are, this linear gradient, this pattern, are attributes that you export when you save your SVG file. You know, this pattern is just a polygon with points in a space. You know, we call it triangle, so you can probably guess what shape this polygon is, but we see it has an XY coordinate, XY coordinate, XY coordinate, and it makes a triangle. Yeah, that would be level 3 usage, right? Like that's more advanced. Maybe some of you have used that in the past, maybe some of you haven't. A lot of times we'll see other things embedded in definitions like when you're creating a sprite. Have you guys, raise your hand if you've created a sprite map before using graphics in some way or another, right? Raise your hand again if you did it using SVGs. Cool, awesome. So then this is nothing new, right? This is cool for those people, but for everyone else, this is how you would do it. You would basically create your SVG objects, load it into this definition section, and then yeah, and then just start including it. You can just use this SVG use tag, and then wherever you bring it up, that object gets rendered. So, yeah. And the cool part about this is that you can do this with external SVG files too. You don't have to have it in line. And so down here, I'm linking to a laboratory SVG file, and I'm referencing an ID of Flask. So yeah, that's kind of how you can use SVGs as like a drop-in replacement for your sprites. That's Scale, by the way. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, so that's more level 2 stuff. And then we get into cool stuff, right? JavaScript stuff for people that are inclined to nerd out that way. Yeah. And yeah, so this would be just blows your mind, right? There's so much stuff you can do with JavaScript and SVGs that can't really give you just one example. But I will give you some examples later on. Yeah, so in the wild. So here's an example of an SVG that's animated and used. Have you guys seen these before, maybe? Maybe, yeah. So these articles came out a couple years ago on Polygon.com. They basically featured this version of Svg Animation. And the way it works is, this is actually, maybe I can do this in here. Yeah, so we can do some live stuff. So I actually have in here embedded SVG stuff, right? And you can kind of see what's happening, right? These are just paths that create objects. Let's see if I turn off this stuff. Right? If I turn off this animation, those are just static line graphics. But the way they animated these articles that they have, maybe I'll link to them real quick, is that these feature articles where they kind of animated these Xbox controls and like et cetera, weaved it in there, and it was pretty awesome at the time. So the way they did it though was pretty ingenious, and I think it kind of sparked a trend as far as SVG stuff goes, in that all they did was they took the stroke of these paths and they animated it, right? So they set the stroke so that it was dashed to the length of the path, and then they animated the path so that it looked like it was drawing the objects. So if we go back and load this PlayStation review, now that you've heard me explain how it works, we can see that basically the objects just look like they're drawing themselves because the path's strokes are animating around the object. So it's really an ingenious way of using stuff, right? Other ways you've probably seen SVGs, I'll keep the console up, is on single-page applications. If you've used CodePen before, and bring this up. Similar applications to this have a bunch of icons that scale and revolve depending on display sizes, and the way they work are SVGs. Whether that's this eye icon, this heart, this little category, the search, these people. So it's kind of cool. Let's go into some stuff. Right. One of the other things I touched on a little bit, which was Svg definitions. And so in those definitions, you can create filters that can now be applied to other HTML objects, right? So here we have an HTML5 video, and here's an example of it applying an SVG filter to change the display. Right, so here's some of these might not be SVG filters, but the idea kind of holds the same. You can now apply SVG filters to other HTML elements. Let's see. Are you guys familiar with code drops? Maybe. So here is. Actually, let me just do this real quick. So for those that haven't really looked at the contents of an SVG file, here's a quick rundown of how they work and how you can use them. Can you guys see this kind of, the parts that are right? Bigger? Sure. So here we have like a basic SVG. Right, this would be like if you just created a box, a rectangle in Illustrator, exported it, sent it to somebody, and then they ran it through some sort of optimization to clear out a lot of the extra stuff that gets dumped into SVGs. So we have an SVG with width, height, a view box, and then we have inside that we have a rectangle with width, height, and a fill color. Yeah, so basically the way it works is the SVG width and height kind of is the rendered space of the SVG in the browser, and then the view box is kind of the virtual space that the graphic takes up. If that makes sense. So if we start moving this view box around, if I change this to 1, you can see that the shape itself hasn't changed, but because the view box is now smaller, that the shape is getting distorted, right? So if we proportionally change the view box, things should look kind of the same. Maybe. Yeah. It looks like they shrink because the view space has increased. So the relative space that the SVG takes up is smaller. Yeah, so we'll change this back. You know, we can change a rectangle the same way we change other HTML elements. We can make it wider or not wider. We can make it taller or shorter. We can change the fill color if you want. You can add a stroke. So that's rectangle. Here's circle. Right, so there's a circle. We can animate the SVG. Here I have a kind of basic animation that takes the center x coordinate and the center y coordinate of the circle and just kind of moves it around and leaves the rest of it the same. So if I apply this animation on the circle element, the circle starts moving around. Yeah, so that's kind of cool. If we want to increase the radius to, or lower it to 20 when it gets to this point, we can do that too. And it just starts moving around. Probably want to change it to 20 here at the end. That makes it look more fluid as it goes around. Yeah, so that's kind of SVG animation with CSS. Other elements you might see when you look at an SVG file is an ellipse. That's kind of the same as a circle. If we look at the properties, there's a CX, CY, RY, RX, fill color, polyline is another SVG object that you'll see your editor output sometimes. It's just a line. Make it a different color. Make it red. We can use CSS if we want to change stuff, or we can change it as a property of the SVG at the same time. Doesn't matter. The CSS will override changes to the property. Yeah, that's kind of the basics of looking at SVG if you've never opened one before. Yeah, and then like more advanced UI stuff more recently that's come out are new techniques involving blurring animations to make them look smoother, right? This is by Lucas Weber, probably butchered his name. And if you haven't seen this, he kind of creates this effect where when he clicks on this, these blobs come out and they kind of like blob out, right? If you've ever tried to do something like that without using SVGs, you probably would have realized it's impossible, you know? But using SVGs, we can go in and we can see that he's applying a, what is this? He's applying a filter of shadowed goo on this item. And if we go in, we can see what that actually looks like. Right, here's the shadowed goo filter. This kind of looks a little weird. I'm gonna. There we go. And in here, this is just a SVG filter property called FE Gaussian Blur, and it takes a source graphic, and that's just a keyword saying that whatever this filter is being applied to, take that, and we're gonna do something to it and call that result a blur. And the standard deviation for FE Gaussian Blur, that's the amount of blur that we're applying when we apply this filter, is a 10. And then here he has a color matrix to kind of adjust the color of that blur as well. And you can kind of see that. So this result takes this blur, or the Gaussian blur takes our source graphic, exports a result, and then that result gets passed into this color matrix, and then it results in a goo, and then goo comes back over here and then returns the object, and then it renders it to the display. So yeah, this is just one of the cool ways that you can apply SVG to HTML stuff without it being SVG in the classical sense, if that makes sense, right? We're using it to create a filter or to create a pattern that we're applying to some other elements. And then if we go back to the wild, if we go to d3js.org, this is a data-driven documents library that basically generates SVGs however you like, right? But they do it in such a way that you can kind of see. Let me put through one of these. For example. So like this is a JavaScript library that is commonly used to render out data visualization, bar graphs, weird circle graphs like this. It's kind of limited by your creativity. And it uses JavaScript to animate these paths to generate these visualizations. So it's pretty cool. Are there any questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the best thing for you to do is to create your graphics and create them with semantic folder structure and naming conventions, right? And that will help you see the content that you're generating in the SVG and then manipulate it using these libraries. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it should, yeah. Depends how granular you want that output to be. So if you just have like a layer group called header, for instance, or yeah, header, we'll stay with header. If you want the developer, if you want to know what you're looking at as far as the paths that you're generating and the polygons that you're creating, it helps if you give it a label, right? So if you just leave it blank and use the conventions of that program, you'll have like layer 1, layer 2, et cetera, et cetera. You can still use that and navigate through that file, but it's a lot easier on yourself if you give it some sort of contextual meaning. Yeah, and then as far as like designing these types of interfaces, I think that knowing that these types of interfaces are possible makes it easier to conceptualize. It's kind of like a chicken and the egg situation for a lot of developers, designers. I think that as a developer that browses CodePen or is following the latest technologies, I'm like, oh, this is really awesome. If only I had somebody that could like design something for me to do with this technology. And I think that seeing this, hopefully, as a designer, you can get inspired a little bit in knowing that you're no longer confined to a lot of the mediums that you thought you were confined to. You know, I feel like SVGs are definitely really amazing for a lot of these things for a lot of the reasons I talked about earlier, right? There's the fact that they grow and shrink and they scale proportionately correctly because they're no longer places of pixels, but rather paths that are defined and then rendered. I think that that perspective lets me take things a lot differently as far as other UI, right? Like, I feel like there's still definitely a place for high-resolution images where you need them because it doesn't make sense to turn, you know, a picture of your family picnic into an SVG. If you've tried doing that, I feel bad for you because the file size is probably enormous, number one, and number two, it doesn't work. It doesn't scale because it's restricted to that resolution that you gave it in the first place. So I think there's definitely still a place for a lot of the newer features coming out as a developer for handling different image sets, picture source sets. If you're interested in finding that, kind of went on a tangent there, but there's a site, responsiveimages.com maybe, and that has more information about how to adopt the latest trends in setting up scaling, quote unquote scaling, rasterized graphics. So.
What are some good tools for the quick prototyping?
Yeah, so for SVG prototyping, I really like using Sketch for creating. Oh, it's up there. A mirror. Yes. I really like using Sketch for creating shapes or the baseline of what I want to animate. And then I like using Snap SVG for actually animating those pieces. So like if I'm creating an animation, for instance, this alligator. Oh, yeah, just kidding. It wasn't on there, my bad. Okay, so if I'm creating something just like this alligator, I can then create two versions, right? One with the alligator's mouth open, and one with the alligator's mouth closed, which it should close in a second. Maybe when I do this. And then I can use something like Snap SVG to then transition between those two states. And I won't really get too involved, but there's a lot of documentation on how to do that. And you kind of just, it's similar to jQuery in that you select an SVG or you load in an SVG from an external source, and then you start doing stuff with it. Right? You can animate from one state to another if you have that end state already in an SVG. Let me show you some stuff here. Just playing around, I created this Svg Badge Generator. And this started out as just a small, not small, but an Svg badge that was just this like shield outline, right? And it was designed by a friend for another friend's presentation on Angular and SharePoint. They wanted to combine the logo, and so they made this shield, and they had an A and an S. I was like, hey, give me that SVG. I want to mess with it. And so what I ended up doing was quite a few different things here. I ended up using a GeoPattern library by somebody in the audience, Jason Long. And he created this GeoPattern library that took a string, and whatever that string was, it would randomly generate a pattern that you could export to SVG and apply in different situations. And so I took that GeoPattern library, and then I also took, if you are familiar with color palettes, there's a site called colorlovers.com, and basically it's a user-submitted color palette library that lets people say, okay, I like this purple, this green, and this blue, and then this is my palette, and other people get to vote on it. It's kind of a little social environment, but they have an API. So what I created was a code pen that let me kind of play with the environment, and it reaches out to that API, grabs a random color palette, and then applies that color palette to various pieces of the shield, right, in the fonts and etc. And then it also applies a animated background and box shadow that matches that color palette. So it's kind of, I think a lot of the cool things you can do with SVGs, and the thing that I want you to take from this is that it's like design is for designers, but it doesn't mean as a developer you can't take something and mess with it. You know, like a lot of cool things happen when you just dig in and play with stuff, right? Like I'm trying to think of other instances not related to SVGs, but I feel like through the course of my professional career, if I didn't know something, and I'm sure this is the same case with a lot of you, I just grabbed like an example somewhere and then started, you know, twisting and, you know, curving it around until it came out. And I was like, oh, this is what I made. And everyone's like, oh, how'd you do that? I'm like, I don't know, kind of, you know, like it just looks cool. So I think there's a lot of room for that with SVGs because the graphic side of stuff is no longer so abstract, right? You can look at the source of this SVG right here. You can see that I have a border. I have, you know, a left section, right? Maybe I didn't semantically name these all that well, but I have a first letter, a second letter, and then I can just completely cut pieces out too. So if I want to hide that first letter, I can just do that here. Playing on, yeah, now it's gone. So, yeah, that's kind of the end of what I have to say. Is there any more questions about stuff? I think, so with context, right, so if it's a, there's pros and cons for different approaches. If you put everything to an external file, that file can get cached, right? That file only has to get loaded once. So if you sprite things into an external file, that's a pro, right? If performance is an objective for your application, that's something to consider. If you need to actually like dig in and animate segments of an SVG, then it's probably better to put it in line, because then you can directly manipulate using CSS, JavaScript, etc. It's not to say that you can't when you have it as an external source, but there are definitely caveats to that, and it's a lot more difficult. Likewise, if you're using it for sprite for user interface, like if it's for this cloud, this forking icon, quote, share icon, etc., and that gets loaded on every page, you have to. The decision is whether you want to offset caching capabilities with maybe instant load or stuff like that. So, any other questions? It's kind of a wide breadth of topic. Chris? That's a great question. I think that the time investment is not that much, really. From a designer's perspective, I mean, like, a lot of times designers will pass on whole project formats, right? Like, as a developer, I've worked with PSD files, Illustrator files, raw files from a designer too. And it's just a matter of exporting and using that technology, right? If you're not restricted to IE8, then it's super easy, right? You don't even have to worry about, backporting, backwards compatibility for older browsers, because everything other than IE8 already uses it. And if you need to use IE8, there's a little bit more overhead, but it's not that much. I didn't click through on a lot of those fallbacks that I linked out in the slides, and we'll post these slides later this week, maybe tonight, hopefully. But really, they're not that difficult. They're you know, in the minimal state, the level 1, as I called it, termed it, whatever. You just replace your JPEGs with your SVG files. There's no overhead there. So I think getting into it isn't that difficult. Starting to adopt these deeper levels of use depends on your team. You know, how much you want to do with it. So, yeah. Yeah, so I actually have not used Adobe Edge. So the question was whether or not I used it, and I haven't really used it. So for the most part, I focus on front-end development, and then design is more or less a necessity of pieces of that, right? If I don't have a designer available to do something, or if it's something small I can do myself, I'll jump in and design it. But a lot of my prototyping comes straight in the browser, where it's, you know, have some sort of interface in a box, round those corners, give it a box shadow, apply a gradient, stuff like that. So, yeah. Sorry, I can't speak to that specifically. In the back? Yeah, so the question was whether or not I can put SVGs in version control pretty successfully, and the answer is yes. If you use GitHub for version control, at least, they have a built-in UI for actually viewing older versions of SVGs as well. So not only do you see the line-by-line changes, but you can also see the visual impacts on those changes in the UI itself. Similar tools will at least have the line-by-line diffing that you might be used to. So, good question. Anyone else? Yes?
Are there any examples of 3D graphics?
Yeah, so 3D graphics in SVG. So when 3D is a matter of like perspective, right? So, like, I'm trying to think of a good example. I don't see 3D as being a limitation because when you draw something in 3D, you're drawing like a cube that has, like if this shield wasn't a shield, if you looked at it kind of like a 3D cube, there are sides that you can't see to this cube, but you can make it a cube. It's all in the way you create that graphic. You know, like you can, if I take a pencil and paper and I draw something that's 3D, it's 3D. So I guess that answers your question, kind of. So there's a different thing in CSS and HTML. You can actually take, maybe this is what you're alluding to, you can actually take like an HTML 3D space and like kind of pseudo turn it at an angle. And you can do the same thing with SVGs, and it's called a matrix transformation. I recommend using a JavaScript library to kind of handle that. They kind of abstract a lot of the mathematics in it, because what it does is if you look at a shape, maybe I have one, maybe. If you look at a path like this border, which basically draws 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points there and fills it. If you look at that shape, these items in that border, this M83.2, this basically says move to 83.2.9, and then it says L is, hold on, I got a cheat sheet somewhere in case questions went here. Line 2, which means, so basically if you look at this from like a document I'm trying to think of, there's like an old programming program that a lot of people probably learned in like elementary school. It's like a turtle, and you can like tell that turtle to like get up and move somewhere, and then put a pen down and start drawing, and then tell it to move somewhere, and it draws a line. So SVGs work very similarly in that this M says move to this coordinate, this L says start drawing a line from here until wherever the next place stuff changes. To find my mouse. Maybe. Oh, okay. And then start drawing another line to this coordinate. So that's kind of how SVGs draw things. And so you can, basically what it is like a matrix of points. And so you can apply another matrix of points to transform it so that the points go to a different location. And so a lot of JavaScript libraries will abstract that process to where you just say, okay, let me select this border path, and let me move this path, or let me skew this path, or let me transform this path in some other way. And then all it does is it goes and transforms using a matrix transformation. And then the new result of that is the new location of that path. So that kind of, I hope, answers that question. Maybe makes a few more people more confused. I don't know. Anything else? Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's definitely a higher chance. It depends on the graphic, right? The more complicated the graphic, the more code it takes SVG to render. So if it's just a basic circle, like I showed an example earlier, it's super easy, right? It's just you have a circle SVG element. You tell it to set the point of that circle here at the center of the x coordinate and the center of the y coordinate, and then you give it the radius, and it just draws a circle. So depending on the complexity of those objects, you could definitely put them into an SVG. Definitely low cost to try at least, and compare file size. Whether or not you want to take a whole sprite approach or individual SVG objects, that might be different too, because different pieces of your application might have differing levels of complexity. So, you know, definitely all of your very simple objects. I think at the beginning of my slides, I had that example of, let me go back. I had this example of this PNG and this SVG pulsing, right? You got to guess which file was bigger. Which would you, like, which file size was larger? Which would you guess? Yeah, so the SVG is actually smaller. Yeah. So it's actually pretty funny how that turns out, right? It depends on that process. Also, it depends on how you're exporting these SVGs. I forgot to mention that sometimes Illustrator or whatever your software likes to export a lot of your hidden layers that you turn off. And so that might lead to a bunch of junk that's in there. Or likewise, if you are exporting directly, this is more of an issue in Photoshop, I think, than Illustrator. If you happen to export an actual image into your SVG file, the way that gets rendered is just like these tags, right? SVG, path, rectangle, circle, ellipse, polygon, line, etc. Except there's another tag in SVG called image, and then it probably is just rendering that image in base 64 and loading it into your SVG, and then your SVG is massive, and you're like, why is it so big? And it's because it's taking the raw base 64 encoded values of that image and putting it in your SVG. because it's either in an underlying layer somewhere when you exported, or you just didn't happen to realize that you thought something was like a shape and it was just an image that you brought in, and so that can cause bloat too. So definitely take a look at the raw output. Don't be afraid to open up that SVG file in Sublime Text or another text editor, anything like that, and say, hey, you know, I know what this is, I know what that is, let's delete this and see what happens. So, yeah. Any other questions in the front? Yeah. So the question was, is there a way to do things more efficiently when you export your SVG files where you're trying to do something like a drop shadow or edge case like that? There definitely is. And sometimes that might be onto you as an informed developer to go in and say, hey, I know SVG has a Gaussian blur filter. Why don't I just take that external layered path, go in and create a blur filter, and then add that to the SVG host, if that makes sense, right? Instead of using that base 64 embedded image in the scenario you described. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to say exactly because I don't know the specific scenario in the export process, but my experience with Sketch, at least, has been really favorable as far as getting what I would consider appropriate output for a lot of those types of things. A lot of times if you use Photoshop, Photoshop's probably the worst culprit as far as throwing in a bunch of embedded images in all these places, because a lot of times when you're dealing in a Photoshop file, you're dealing with a lot of layers of, you know, total website presence, right? Like a header graphic, all these things. So a lot of times that stuff gets outported. And you can definitely, when you save as SVG, there's definitely settings in there that help limit that, but it's probably the biggest culprit as far as getting malformed SVG per se. So, sure, in the back. Yeah, so I built my presentation using slides.com. This is actually not really related to my topic, but it's okay. It's a platform that was created by this guy, Hakeem something. Don't remember his last name. I apologize if he ever hears this. But basically, he created somewhere. I recommend checking him out, by the way. It's hakeem.se. Hasn't been that active recently, I don't think, but he has a lot of cool experiments and creative ways at looking at HTML, CSS, front-end stuff. But he created slides.com, and it's a standalone JavaScript slide thing, but he created the UI that has like a platform as a service. You can pay him money to get premium features and stuff like that, but it's pretty awesome. And the reason why it's awesome is because you can embed your own CSS. Since everything's in Chrome, you can animate your own SVGs, whatever you put in there as a web developer, your presentation's using your medium, so it's kind of your canvas, so to speak. Yeah, and well, speaking of that, I gotta give credit where credit's due. That's actually from Wake Up with IE8. Actually, I took the SVG directly from their site and their animation specifically embedded in my slides, since I was just linking out to them anyway. But the animation is, if we look at it, I can bring it up really quick. Actually, on here, I have to dig quite a bit, so that might be a poor place to look for it. So on here, okay, here we go. The animation is this heartbeat short. 1 second input. Heartbeat short. Here you go. And basically it just changes the width and height through a course of whatever the time frame of that animation is, if you're familiar with CSS animations. When I do post these slides, you might not get some of these animations. I didn't go through and vendor prefix some of them, and I'm using the latest Chrome Canary, so some of these might not display. I don't know, but this might, I think. And yeah, you can feel free to dig into the source and look at this stuff too. Yeah. So you probably can't see that back there unless I do this. So those are the keyframes for that animation. And just boom. So any other questions? I think, yeah, in the back. Hype? Yeah, by Tumult, I think. It's got a picture of a hummingbird. We're used to. Okay. Yeah, I used. Question was whether or not I've used Hype before, and I've used Hype in the past, and it's a graphical user interface for creating, I think, HTML, CSS animation stuff. My experience is kind of short-lived, so I can't talk too much about it, but if you're not used to this type of stuff, going in and making CSS animations, transitions, transformations, etc., you can definitely use a program like Hype or I think Adobe Edge occupies the same space. What does? Animate. So yeah, there's definitely things out there that can help you get an intro to CSS3 animations, stuff like that. Sure.
So what would be the benefit of using SVG for the circle square, which is square?
Okay, the question was what would be the benefit for using SVG circle or square versus HTML element div with div with just a box or a circle generated by border radius. Not much benefit, to be honest. I don't think either objects in either language give you an additional load. It'd probably be a detriment to using SVG because if you externalize it, it's another HTTP request performance-wise. But it kind of depends on your space and what those are used for. But pseudo HTML graphics using CSS are kind of hacky occupations of the same technical space as SVG, if that makes sense. I think that's a good description of what they are, because they're not really intended. A lot of times, if any of you guys have seen CodePen or various tutorial blog sites, they'll be like, oh, like, you know, here's this awesome, you know, MacBook rendered in just one HTML element, and then you look at the source of that HTML element. So yeah, it's one div, but like it's like 500 lines of box shadows or something, you know, or then the pseudo before and after element that also has another 500 lines of box shadow. So it's really cool and it's great experimentation, but this is probably the way to go if you want to actually work with a designer that uses their medium, because they're not gonna hand you an asset that's like, oh no, just throw this div in there and then use this CSS style sheet. So yeah. Any other questions? Feel free to expand on other stuff because there's a lot of things I haven't touched on that kind of go past the designer threshold pretty fairly, right? There's the Snap SVG stuff that I brought up pretty briefly, and then the D3 data visualization stuff, which I failed at bringing up, kind of. But go ahead in the back.
I'm a designer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a recommendation on what software to use? I mean, the Sketch sort of seems like what I've seen with Spotify, why this whole I've noticed that on the Illustrator. So I just think
Yeah, from a developer's perspective, it's easier for me to kind of like jump to the latest thing because I'm not that attached to begin with. And the question about what software to use right now is kind of up to you to decide, right? If you're very good at using Illustrator, you shouldn't have to jump to the latest software to render the same thing, right? The processes that you're used to are the same in Sketch or any other program that deals with that medium. So I think being comfortable in that environment is more important than the process of streamlining it because there's so many things where you can use some sort of GUI to optimize your SVG file. You can use SVGO in your terminal without even a JavaScript build task manager, which is what I use a lot of the time if I'm not in like a web project that uses Gulp or Grunt. That handle a lot of the problems that you might get from Illustrator out of the box. So I don't think it's that important. As long as when you're pulling these assets into your projects, you've taken the appropriate actions to make sure that they're as good as they should be. A lot of times you might not care, it's just an SVG file, so if there's an additional kilobyte of overhead, it's not a big deal. But sometimes when performance is that goal, then it's important. So, yeah. One more question? Maybe? Maybe not? Oh, sure. Which bar? Yeah.
So Adam and I were texting, and we were thinking about someone straight downstairs, really there, literally right below us.